Welcome to Women in Leadership Talk, where you'll hear from successful women who are empowering other women with their stories of adversity, resiliency, and success. And here is your host, Vicki Bradley, founder and CEO of Women in Leadership Empowered.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. Thank you so much for joining us for the Women in Leadership Talk podcast. We are very excited to have a conversation today with Gabriela Alcalde. She has a tongue twister of a last name for early. It's early for us. Anyway, thank you, Gabriela, for joining us. We're so thrilled to have you here and excited to jump in and have a wonderful conversation with you today.
Thank you, Vicki. I'm so excited to be joining you.
Awesome. And of course, we want to thank our audience for being here. We know you have a choice as to what podcast you listen to. And I know you hear me say this every time, but it is true. Whether you're taking the dog for a walk and you're just chiming in to listen, we appreciate that. And let us know how we're doing. Give us a review, follow us. But most importantly, let us know if there's other topics you want us to talk about. So I've invited Gabriela to join us, which you're going to find out here in a moment. So let me give you just a little bit of feedback about her and why I asked her to join us on the show. She is the CEO of the Sewall Foundation and is a creative anti-supremacist leader with experience in the philanthropic, nonprofit, and grassroots sectors. She has a new book releasing called What Your Comfort Cost Us. And that's coming out very soon. We're going to talk about this book. And I'm really excited to dig into this because I think it's a topic that we get so caught up on the hamster wheel, we don't even think about what the cost is. So I'm really excited to hear about your book. But she also provides workplace leaders with a lot of concrete and tangible advice on building healthier, more inclusive workspaces. And this becomes really important, especially for women of color. And you've seen a lot of statistics on, what happens to women of color, and especially how that impacts over white comfort. So I do want to talk about this today and get into it in more detail. There's also a number of other things that she does, but I don't want to steal her thunder. So I want her to jump in and tell us more about this journey she's been on and just like what really, Gabriela, has led you to write this book, because I'm sure there'll be some controversy over it. So just kick us off here.
Yeah. I think first, I love writing. It's one of those creative activities that I do. It's part of my job, but also for fun. When I was a kid, I wrote, creatively, just it was a nice pastime. And during the pandemic, we were also locked in and not lots of options for what to do. And I started writing a lot again. Some of it was just reflecting. And one of the things that I had noticed through my career was that whether I was at conferences or in Zoom rooms during the pandemic or just in, workshops, I would talk to other, particularly women of color leaders who would share very similar stories about their experiences in workplaces. And so I started sort of connecting those dots and realizing, hey, my experience is not unique. It's not about me. There is something else going on where these very motivated, talented, skilled, brilliant leaders are facing very similar barriers. And so I became curious about it and I just started writing again for myself. I shared it with a couple of friends and actually with my husband, and they all really encouraged me. They said, this would be a great book. You should write it. And my initial reaction was no. Was when would I have the time and why would anybody want to read my book? Which is something we need to check ourselves as women, right? That we have that voice is like, why me? And then I thought I had the idea, a lot of what I do is culture change. And one of the most, I think, important strategies for culture change is storytelling. And I thought, what if I actually use the book as a vehicle, not just to tell my story, but to tell the stories of many women of color as an invitation to consider ways to change our culture, to be more inclusive, to be safer for everybody, not just the white dominant culture, and also not to not exclude people. So I embarked on writing, and I would write over the weekends and in the evenings because I was working full time. And And I was very lucky that a publisher was interested. So here we are now with the book coming out March 11th. So
Well, and I wouldn't say lucky. I would say intentional. So you brought up a number of things there that I think are super important. One, we do tell ourselves these stories that we're not enough, or why would anybody want to hear my message, or even what you just said, I was lucky. Like those are limiting, right?
yeah,
And that's so important. Like you had the courage to take this on and not only tell your story, but to tell other stories and to have a bigger impact. Because what we were saying earlier, sometimes we're on that hamster wheel of life and we don't even think about like what we think might be completely inclusive. Somebody else goes, oh no, you're excluding me in that. And we see this all the time, whether it's women of color, whether it's women, period, whether it's men as well. Like, I mean, it happens in a lot of different dynamics. And so I think what you've done is open up the conversation. Like,
yeah.
how do we be better? And what are the cultures that we want to create and be part of? Because there are choices too, right? Like as to whether you want
Yeah.
to play in that playground or not.
Yeah, I think being intentional is the piece. I think a lot of times we just assume that workplace culture is sort of a neutral, it's a something that just happens and we use the same structures, we use the same processes, the same decision-making tools, and we don't even ask ourselves, does this align with the values of the organization? Does this align with the values of the people working at the organization or that we're serving? And so, really, the book is about how can we be intentional? How can we make sure that we're asking ourselves, are our values reflected and manifested and reinforced through everything in our workplace cultures and structures and practices and our leadership models?
Yeah, yeah. And we see this a lot. I mean, you and I both work in a lot of corporate environments. And often I don't think it is intentional. I think it's that we just don't
Right.
pause long enough to ask the
Yep.
questions,
Yep.
which is really important. And this came up with a client I had just back in the fall, and their culture, they were trying to really redefine it, and they were saying, yes, we're people centric, yes, we want, it's all about our people and our customers, but yet they were creating policies that were completely opposite of what they were attempting to do, and they weren't mindful that that was even
Right.
happening. And so when
Right.
I called it out, I said, well, how does this how does this support being a people culture?
Yeah.
And the CEO was like, I don't get it. And I'm like, okay, well, so I spelled it out more. And then finally he went, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, this is
Mhm.
completely opposite of what we're trying to do. And so, I guess where I want to go with that a little bit, Gabriela, is there is a cost, which is the name of your book. Maybe let's talk about what you've discovered as that cost, and then we'll just kind of run with this a little bit because I have a number of questions for you.
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is that I believe, and there is extensive evidence, that the cost is for everybody. So while the book is focused on what I view as the transformational leadership of women of color, because we navigate through an intersectional identity of minoritized by race and by gender,
Mm.
the system is really not helping any of us because it's only allowing a very narrow perspective on what leadership is. It's only allowing us to practice a very narrow type of workplace culture. And by doing that, it is both limiting the creativity and the possibility in our workplaces. So our communities are suffering because we're not as creative as we could be in our work. The individuals at those workplaces are suffering because they are being told, here's where you need to fit yourself,
Mm.
regardless of who you are, regardless of what your experience is, what your talents are. And I have personal experience as a leader, sort of in doing what you just pointed out, sort of identifying. And for me, it's a very simple practice of here are our values. What do the values mean? What does that look like in practice? And now let's look at our policies. Let's look at our
Mm.
onboarding and recruitment. Let's look at how we do our staff meetings, our job titles. So everything, how we deal with our vendors, and compare that. Are we practicing our values? And the answer in most workplaces is no.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's not intentional. We're very busy. And a lot of people, I would say, have gotten frustrated with me when I'm like, no, we're going to spend more time on the culture because that is the foundation of everything. And if we don't get clear on what our values are, nothing else is going to align. And we may not know why, but it's going to feel bad to some people because we live in a culture that centers the experiences, the perspectives, even the version of history of people who identify as white. That means that people who are furthest from that identity are experiencing the most discomfort and, frankly, lack of safety.
Yeah.
Usually, lack of psychological safety and a lot of it is unintentional.
Of
I
course.
don't think most workplaces or most people set out to do things that would be harmful to others. But the reality is that there is harm. So that is one of the first sort of areas of learning when it comes to power dynamics, is that intent and impact are two different things. And we need to focus on the impact, not only the intent. And I think a lot of times we get stuck on, but I didn't mean that, or that's not why we developed that policy. That's great. And I have no interest in making anyone feel guilty or ashamed because those are not helpful emotions, frankly, when it comes to the workplace. But we need to focus on the impact, and we need to work towards on how do we create the cultures that actually encourage us to feel curious, to feel creative, to feel cared for, and to feel courageous so that we can actually have exciting workplaces that come up with new and different ideas that benefit all of us.
Yeah, no, I agree. So you mentioned a number of things there about, like, what I heard from that is, how do you really engage and bring the best of everyone out? And we don't do it intentionally, but we stifle, right? And, one of the things that I know you talk about is this white comfort. And maybe let's just dive into, what does that mean? Because, you'll hear this comment, right? Or white privilege. And oftentimes you have people will say, well, I don't even understand what that means. So maybe break that down for us a little bit. And then how does that differ? Like when we look at safety, because you mentioned there's psychological safety, there's physical safety, emotional safety, like there's all different parameters. That's kind of two questions, but let's kind of go there and talk about white comfort.
Yeah. I'm going to try to, I think these are really complex concepts, so I'm going to try to provide a simplified version that hopefully will be accessible while not losing the nuance, because I think we often lose the nuance in these really complex concepts. So I think the shorthand is, white comfort is a predictable consequence of prioritizing white interests, or the interests of white culture and those who identify as white, of having a history where we have punished people who have challenged or have been perceived as challenging white privilege, including white people who have done that. And that's why I'm talking about the system. And the book really focuses on the system and not individuals, because I think we sort of go down rabbit holes when we talk about individuals.
Agreed.
Anyone who has challenged that privilege or comfort, or even the resistance of public discourse in the US. There's a lot of resistance to talking about race and racism. And I think another really important piece of white comfort is that Americans live highly segregated lives. Most Americans do not encounter people in their daily lives who are of different race and background in their neighborhoods, in their work, in their schools, in their places of worship. They tend to be around people who are like them. So when you are so used to only having your perspective, your experience around you, anything that's different than that is going to feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying on that, and my head goes in two directions. I don't disagree with you, because I grew up in the South, and that was very much the case. Right. And it wasn't until I relocated to South Carolina, then the demographics were very different than what I had grown up with. Right. And then when I moved to Canada, to Toronto, which is a hugely multicultural country and city, it was very, very different. But what you just shared there, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial on that, Gabriela, in a very good way. But I think that's true no matter what your ethnic background is.
Yeah.
Because you tend, and I see that here in Canada a lot, where, you have pockets of communities. So if you're Jamaican, you move to this area where it's considered Jamaican. If you're Italian, you move to this area. So this happens, I think, because we, as human beings, we will often gravitate.
Yeah, it's more comfortable.
Yes, exactly.
For everybody, it's more comfortable. I think the distinction and the reason that this is different and why there's conversation around white comfort versus, Black comfort or Indigenous comfort is that the way that power has operated.
Okay, good distinction.
means that the history, for example, the comfort. So if you think not that long ago in the United States, if somebody who was not white entered certain spaces, spoke to certain people, tried to access certain institutions, they would be punished for that.
Yeah.
So that is still in the psyche of the culture. That's built into our institutions. A few decades is a very short time in human history, right? So it takes us so much longer. So we're still operating with some of what we've inherited, and that has been reinforced. So while we all gravitate towards people who are like us, I, for example, I'm an immigrant. I have to be conversant. I have to understand white dominant culture because that is the culture of most workplaces. That is the culture of the educational institutions that I have attended. That was the way that I would be able to succeed. Whereas if you're a white person, you do not have to be conversant in African American culture or in Latino culture or Indigenous culture. You don't have to know anything about our history. People don't need to know where Peru is, right? When I mention it, a lot of people don't know. And that's because it's not expected or required. And I think that is actually more common in the US than other countries when you look at sort of the history that people learn in different countries.
Yes.
I grew up in Peru. We learned world history. So we had to know about when I moved to the US as a child, we were learning the history of our county.
Yes.
Right. And the reason I said that white comfort is a predictable consequence is to hopefully take some of that anxiety and guilt that people feel when it's named. I am very comfortable with change because I'm an immigrant. I moved around a lot. I had to learn it differently. I had to be comfortable with people speaking a language that wasn't my native language. I had to be comfortable with people behaving in a way that was different than my culture. I had to learn that. That was not a choice. There's nothing special about the way I was born that allowed me to navigate change so well. I had to learn it. If you grow up in a way that you're never challenged and you never have to learn a different way of thinking or consider different perspectives, it's going to feel really not good when you are suddenly confronted with a very different perspective. So again, I'll repeat it. It is a predictable consequence, and it is not a individual behavior. Yeah. It is a cultural reality that we center white comfort. And that just means that we need to become aware of it.
Well, I think that awareness on many levels is so important. And I do agree with you that often we know what we know. And there's this fear of getting outside of that. So to your point, when I grew up in the South, right? And that's all I knew. And then when I went into the working world, all of a sudden I was sent to the Midwest. And so then I was sent to the West Coast. And so I started learning just the different nuances, even within the United States. And I think some of that comes from is the US is so big and vast. Right. So people do kind of stay in their comfort zones. Yeah. And so, kind of what we were talking about a minute ago, you don't necessarily go outside your comfort zone. And if you don't travel's probably one of the I would say one of the most important things you can do for yourself. And if you're raising kids, it's one of the most important things you can do for them, because then you actually see and experience differences. Doesn't mean one's right, one's wrong, but you're just experiencing differences. By the way, Peru is on my bucket list.
It's beautiful.
Well, that's what I hear. And it is on my bucket list to visit. But, you know, when you're caught in this paradigm of this is how this is, and you hear this, right? Even if, and I am going to be a little more controversial, even if you look at what's happening in Palestine and Israel, right? You have cultures that are very, very centered on what's happening there. And that's what they know. And kids are being raised to believe certain things because they've never seen anything differently. So I do agree with you. I think that, you know, when we're getting caught in this cycle of staying within and not really looking in totality, or not being curious about what is it like to experience as a woman period, but as a woman of color in particular, like, what is that like?
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, I talk a lot in the book about curiosity and empathy. And I think those are the values that I'm asking us to pull on. It is not what is best. You know, you said in my bio, an anti-supremacist leader. I chose that specifically because I don't want a supremacist culture. I don't care who is supreme. It is a matter of, when you have a supremacist culture, you are excluding other possibilities. You're excluding other perspectives and ideas. And as an immigrant, I am very aware that there is a wealth of options for how to live and how to imagine the world. And we're missing out, and we're depriving ourselves. We're depriving our communities and our societies when we narrow the lens of what is acceptable. And that's where the white comfort becomes problematic. When people say, if you make me uncomfortable, I'm going to punish you. And so the book starts with a distinction between what is comfort and what is safety. And how can we help ourselves understand the difference so that we don't, maybe usually unintentionally, cause harm in the workplace because we say, oh, that made me uncomfortable, I'm feeling attacked by you. It's like, I made you uncomfortable because I'm different. That is not an attack. That is not a lack of safety. And so many policies can actually have a very negative impact on all people of color, differently abled people, right? So anybody who is not part of the dominant culture. And those harms can be long lasting, and they can affect your livelihood. They can affect your psychological well-being, your physical health, because as we know, our bodies and our minds are all connected. So it does have a very real impact. And we see that in the statistics around pay, around leadership roles. The book goes into all kinds of statistics that I'm not going to bore our listeners with, but there is evidence of the impact of this. And that's why it's so important for us to learn how to sit with the discomfort and to know this is not harming me. This is an opportunity for learning. This is, the curiosity that you said. That is, to me, that's the critical approach. Just really breathing through that curiosity.
Yeah. I totally agree with you on so many levels, that where curiosity comes in, especially in big organizations. Like when you can keep that openness and that curiosity and more questions versus answers even, right? Like the innovation that comes from that and pulling from those diverse perspectives are like, I mean, that is, I don't know. And it's hard to get people to recognize that, right? Like I do a lot of, well, actually I'm doing my transdisciplinary PhD right now. And it's all about what we were just talking about. Like, how do you pull different perspectives to solve in a much bigger way? And people think, oh, is it this? Is it that? And it's like, no, there's so many different ways that you can approach things. But you do have to slow down long enough and ask those questions. And so I know in your book, you talk about empathy and productive discomfort. So, that you mentioned that can be such a great pathway for change. Can you maybe share an example of, because I mean, I'm with you on empathy, and I think our world we're getting less empathetic.
Yeah.
So what might be some ways that people can really step into empathy and have a better pathway for the future?
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you're asking about that, Vicki. You know, that's the reason I decided to center the book around stories.
Mm-hmm.
I really believe that stories are very powerful tools. They help us glimpse into realities that we have not had ourselves, maybe couldn't even imagine, right? Empathy allows us to be aware of and to vicariously experience the feelings of others. It's like a bridge to empathy. So that's why the core of the book is really the stories of women of color that I interviewed and mine as well.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would say is empathy is a practice. I have talked to people who say, well, I'm just naturally very empathetic, or I'm naturally not very empathetic. It's a practice like anything else.
For
You
sure.
have to be diligent about it. You have to try it. You have to do it. You have to sit with the discomfort of thinking about, how would somebody else experience this? What is their perspective? What are they experiencing feelings wise right now? Why might they see this in a different way? I think when we practice empathy, we really lean into what I call constructive discomfort, which you named as well. When we learn something new, when we're finding our way to a new place, learning a new skill, there's a moment, if we pause enough to be aware, a stage when we feel uncomfortable, when we're literally stepping outside of our comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if any of our listeners have raised children, you can observe this. I have 2 children who are now in college, but you kind of see their little brains. There's a moment where they're like, ooh, that is one step further than I've ever gone before. Mm-hmm. And there's a fear and there's a discomfort. And that is what I call the productive discomfort, is where we allow empathy to let us stay in that space just a little bit longer. And that's where growth happens. That's where we become something that we weren't before. And I do believe that now more than ever, we need to share our stories. We need to listen to each other's stories, really listen with empathy, and sit through that discomfort so that we can grow together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, that's a very powerful one. And there's so many things when it comes to empathy and even just the self-awareness, right?
Yes.
Like recognizing where we are and where we're meeting people, right? And that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean you're going to agree with every person you come in contact with. It doesn't mean you're going to like every person you come in contact with, or every situation you come in contact with. But it is taking that step back and asking yourself, like, how am I engaging in this? And how is this impacting me? How am I feeling through this? And why am I feeling this way? Right?
Yeah. And I think you said a couple of really critical things there, Vicki. You don't have to agree with someone to have empathy for them. Yeah. You don't even have to like them to have empathy. And those are important distinctions. I think a lot of times we think, well, I don't like you, so I don't need to pay attention. I'm like, no, actually, I think that when you don't like someone or you don't agree with someone, it is even more reason to practice empathy, because it's not going to come naturally. And those are the opportunities for growth, right? If you say something that I'm like, I've never thought of that, or I have a really big sort of like emotional, physiological reaction, that's when I want to pause and be really curious, and then extend that practice of empathy and say, okay, why would she say this? Why would she have that perspective? And that's where that opening happens. Yeah. And that's at the core of the book, is inviting people, for women of color who've experienced these stories. Hopefully there's a sense of being seen and witnessed, that they're not alone, and amplifying our voices. And that is certainly a purpose for writing the book. But really what I realized in finishing the book was that the primary purpose was an invitation for those people who don't have access to these stories, who haven't felt them. That's why we share stories, right? To invite you into perspectives and experiences that you haven't had, and that will hopefully amplify your own world.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I was thinking about that when we first started talking as well. And I'm glad you brought it back up, because so often doesn't matter what gender you are, often you think, oh, I'm the only person experiencing this.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And that is not true. Like when you start sharing stories, when you invite people in to get to know them and connect with them, you learn so much. And then you have those aha moments where it's like, oh, I thought I was the only person who felt like that. Right. And that's very powerful because that also helps you to step forward and say, okay, how did Gabriela navigate this? You know, what were her experiences? Mine were, they maybe not exactly the same, but similar. But it's more about how do we navigate it together and building those support systems that help you navigate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think part of it is realizing that we don't live in a zero-sum world.
Yeah.
Right. So just because you give air to someone else's perspective doesn't mean that your perspective is being shut down. In fact, it is giving more options for everybody. And that is my hope that we see through these stories, that actually the type of workplace that the women of color, that leaders that I interviewed are dreaming of and are creating would benefit everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are places where your whole humanity can be present.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's a great segue into what's next. Right? Raising that vibration of humanity, more important than ever. And you do see lots of people innovating in ways that we never thought of, right? And bringing things to our world that help many, not everybody. And that's okay too. Like if you can impact one person, that's why I started doing the podcast, right? And having an incredible guest on, because it's like, if what we share today has impact for one person, then we've really done our jobs, right? Yeah. So let's talk about that for a minute, Gabriela. How do we be better at speaking up and being proactive about even recognizing, right? Especially when you're sitting in those corporate environments, like, you know, when you recognize that that's happening, that someone's being excluded or, you know, their voice is not being heard.
Yeah. I think, you know, the first thing is definitely connect with people that are different from you. Read, because I think you mentioned travel. That's an amazing way to learn. Yeah. If you don't have access to travel, read books, novels by people from different backgrounds than yours, because it gives you a view into their world. And I think it's, you know, giving all of ourselves a little grace and recognizing that change is really hard for humans. It is particularly hard for humans who have had more power and control than others in society. And recognizing that if you have more privilege and power, that doesn't mean that you did anything to get that. So sort of giving yourself a little self-compassion and saying, okay, I want to be curious. In order to be curious, we have to let go of that self-blame and we have to have compassion. I think about, you know, a lot of people have been saying, how does your book merge with what's happening right now? Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It makes me think about a couple of decades ago, I was doing a lot of work on intimate partner violence. And I remember coming across this cross-cultural research, and I'm forgetting the name of the researcher right now, but I was so fascinated by it. And it's been in my mind a lot because it found that in countries where women had been gaining rights, particularly through changes in legislation, mm-hmm. there was an increase in violence against women. Mm. And this was across countries.
Wow.
Right? And this was, they were just looking at gender. Mm-hmm. And I think about that. And I think about the stage we're in right now, where we've made significant changes over the past few decades. Mm-hmm. We're not even close to where we could be, right? There is so much better than we could be. The disparities are real. The harms are real. And yet we had made a lot of progress.
Yeah.
And those with historically more power, not all, I'm not implicating all, but the system is lashing out. This is a thing that humans do. We have seen it across different countries. When there's a big shift and a group that did not used to have as much freedom gains more freedom, there are groups that feel more powerful groups that feel like, wait, does that mean I'm going to lose my freedom? Which is why I mentioned the importance of moving away from thinking about the world as a zero-sum equation. So we're in that stage right now, sort of thinking about it as a massive cultural temper tantrum with very dire consequences for sure. But I think this is part of how culture changes. We have seen significant shifts, and now we have a sort of a pushback.
Yeah.
So I think about that research a lot, and I think about the importance of really changing our thinking around freedom and rights as being a limited or scarce.
Yeah, no, I love how you brought that in. And it's so true. It's so true. There is more than enough. And we put the parameters around it. We put ourselves in that box. And I think there is fear. There is fear that is being broadcasted everywhere, because systems are breaking down, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if we just take it back even to some of the most simplistic things like, contracts, agreements, job evaluations, even if I use that as an example, those have traditionally been very male nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
And we are looking at these systems and we're saying, oh, hang on a second, these systems aren't working anymore.
Yeah.
And so there is that fear of, oh, well, like, look what's happening in the government in the US. Like, so many jobs are being lost. And some people are like, oh my God, how could that happen? And then some people are saying, well, maybe it's time that we rethink how those systems could operate in a more fluid, inclusive manner. And who knows what's going to happen? Like, it's a very interesting time that we're in, but we still, as humanity, I believe, coming with that lens of curiosity, coming with that lens of what's possible, not the scarcity, to your point, that enables us to continue to push forward with changes that will be better for everyone, not just a particular segment.
Yeah, I think something you said, Vicki, is the recognition that anything that happens to one of us affects all of us. So even when you said, if this podcast, touches one person, well, that person has a ripple effect on others.
Exactly.
So there's nothing that ever only happens to one person. Yeah. There's nothing that ever happens only to one population or one community, because we're all connected. We're all interdependent. Mm. And so to me, that is a hopeful recognition that we have enough for all of us. And it is in our best interest to recognize that there is enough for all of us, because we're all interconnected. And when some of us suffer, all of us are suffering, including those who have disproportionate power and privilege, because unearned privilege is also a burden.
Yeah.
It puts you in a box. I've raised sons, and men get put into boxes.
Of course.
So yes, there is patriarchy that benefits men, but it also deprives them of their full humanity. It tells them this is the way you can be. These are the only options.
Yeah.
And those aren't healthy.
Not at all. And very difficult. I think your sons are probably close in age to my son, and I see the impact that it has, and it's not healthy. It's not healthy or helpful for our future.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Wow, Gabriela. We could just solve all the world's problems today. So we do have to wrap up, but what would be one key message you really want the audience to walk away with today? I know that's a big ask.
Yeah. I'm going to actually circle back to what we were talking about earlier, because I think it's the critical pieces. Be curious. Approach new ideas, new information, new people with curiosity. And part of that curiosity is practice empathy, including compassion with yourself. So curiosity and empathy with self-compassion. I think that is what we need right now. And that is what is going to allow us to explore new ways of working and new ways of living.
Nice. Love that. Wow. Thank you so much. Great conversation. Your book's coming out. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, I actually have my own copies. It doesn't.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. But I got my own copy here. So super excited to have it and be able to actually touch it and feel it. So yeah, invite everybody to read these stories.
Nice. And so for people who are listening, and I'm sure they're excited to actually read and just see it from your perspective and the people that you've interviewed, where will they be able to find your book mid-March?
You can find it anywhere where they sell books online. There's ebooks and the paperback. You can get it on through Goodreads, through Bookshop. I always encourage everybody, go to your local bookstore and ask for it to support our local bookstores. But if you don't have access to a local bookstore, the online retailers are also carrying it, so you can find it that way.
Awesome. And how do they find you? If somebody has questions from the conversation we've had today, where would they find you?
Yeah, so I do have a website. It's mgalcalde.com, mgalcalde.com. And you can learn a little bit more about me and more about the book. And there is a way that people can send me a message.
Amazing. So audience, you've heard that. After you've listened to this podcast, if you have questions, reach out to Gabriela. You can reach out to me. If you're not sure how to get a hold of her, reach out to me. I'll make sure it gets shared with her. Thank you all so much for being here today. And Gabriela, a special thank you to you for the courage for writing your book and for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Our pleasure. And audience, thank you. We appreciate you being here. We have a gift for you. You can go on to our Women in Leadership Empowered website and you will be able to take a free leadership quiz, which will really give you some insight as to how you're showing up in the world and, some areas that, you might not have even realized that, hey, this is an area I want to work on. So have some time and go take that leadership quiz. Sorry, my tongue's getting tied here. My throat's sore. Anyway, we thank you for joining us again today. And we look forward to having you join us again on the next Women in Leadership Talk podcast.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Be safe. Thank you for joining us for WIL Talk, sponsored by Women in Leadership Empowered. To learn more about our programs, please visit www.willempowered.com. We look forward to seeing you in our community.